The land that now hosts Fort Benjamin Harrison was once the site of Lawrence Township's earliest settlers. It was made into an army post by President Theodore Roosevelt. Welcome once again to another edition of Hoosier History. I'm Rick Maultra. Today we pay tribute to Fort Benjamin Harrison, a military base whose worldwide contributions date back to the turn of the century. The present site, now known as Fort Benjamin Harrison, was formerly occupied by Indians of the Delaware and Miami tribes. They were encamped primarily along Indian Creek and Fall Creek in Lawrence Township of Marion County, Indiana. The remnants of where these Indian camps existed can be found atop the ridges of hills along the banks of Fall Creek. This area of dense wood where bobcats and bears once roamed is now the site of Fort Harrison's field training exercises. Before Oakland became Oaklandon and Lanesville became Lawrence, the tiny town of Spring Valley was located near the present-day Fort Golf Course. Prior to the Civil War, this location was also home to the resort known as Minnewan Springs. People came to the resort for the water's alleged medicinal value.
Around 1867, they developed what was called the Minnewan Springs. That was a health springs, and they turned it into a local resort for the people from Indianapolis. The local area developed into what was called Spring Valley from the numerous springs that we had in this area. And they had a church, or the first church out here, and the first schoolhouse was over by the Fort Benjamin Harrison Golf Course, one on either side of Shafter Road.
When the federal government announced the closure of the Civil War arsenal in Indianapolis, the son of President Benjamin Harrison decided to intercede. Lieutenant Colonel Russell B. Harrison, a veteran of the Spanish-American War, lobbied the commanding general of the Army to establish a permanent military post at the arsenal site, the grounds upon which Arsenal Technical High School now sits. The Army readily agreed, as they were eager to create homes for a military that had doubled in size during the years of 1898 through 1902. Once the first wave of troops arrived here from the Philippines, however, a persuasive group of Indianapolis residents voiced their displeasure in having troops quartered so close to the city. Undaunted, Russell Harrison implemented a plan to sell the arsenal grounds to the city of Indianapolis to establish a large educational institution that was to become Arsenal Tech. With the funds from that sale, Harrison then purchased a tract of land southwest of Indianapolis, which the Army deemed unsuitable. Finally, Harrison surveyed a tract of land in northeast Marion County of Lawrence Township that impressed him. He noted that the growth of forest and rolling terrain would be ideal for the purpose of military maneuvers. The Army agreed, and steps to purchase the land were taken by the government.
Well, they attempted to purchase the land in a pretty standard fashion. Congress appropriated money, land negotiators came to the area and began to buy the various farms that would make up Fort Harrison. Well, it got interesting when some of the farmers near the very end held out, believing they could drive the price of their land up in order for the package to be complete. Well, they got too ambitious. At one point, the farmers were asking more than was left in the appropriation to spend, and Congress was not about to change that amount of money. And the word came down that if the land could not be purchased at a price that the government wanted to pay, then the entire deal was off. A local congressman named Overstreet immediately mobilized local merchants, realizing that he couldn't move the farmers, nor was he likely to move Congress off its position. And so he stepped in with a number of local merchants who formed a merchants association who each pledged money to make up the difference between what was being asked and what was being offered. The idea being quite simply that these merchants would benefit tremendously by having an Army establishment in the area. And the merchants agreed with the idea. And so some fairly famous names like L.S. Ayres, Bob's Merrill and Company gave certain amounts of money to put into a fund that would then supplement the Army, or I should say the congressional appropriation, that would pay for the land. And literally, the check that was finally written to cover the entire amount is the check that saved Fort Harrison back in the 1900s.
Though the acreage was officially purchased in June of 1904, building construction did not begin until 1906. The naming of the fort fell into the hands of President Theodore Roosevelt. His predecessor in the White House had been Indiana's own President Benjamin Harrison. Roosevelt owed some of his success to Harrison and showed his gratitude by authorizing the new military post to be named in his honor, a recognition that son Russell Harrison earnestly lobbied Washington for shortly after the death of his father. Though the fort was not completed until 1910, nearly 20,000 troops from the regular Army and the National Guard held joint maneuvers on the base. The naming of the original streets at Fort Benjamin Harrison primarily honored those who served in the Spanish-American War. The street encircling the parade ground was named for General Henry Ware Lawton, who distinguished himself in the Battle of Santiago, Cuba, and later lost his life taming an insurgent uprising in the Philippines. Shafter Road honors the memory of William R. Shafter, who was commanding general of the American forces in Cuba, and Wheeler Road remembers Major General Joe Wheeler, an ex-Confederate Civil War general, who impacted the fight at San Juan Hill. By 1908, the 10th Infantry arrived at Fort Benjamin Harrison. It was the first regiment to be garrisoned at the base. The 10th brought with it a very impressive record, which included successful campaigns against the Indians on the western frontier and the Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War. Under the command of Colonel Henry Greene, who also served as Fort Harrison's first base commander, the 10th Infantry was responsible for developing a closer working relationship between the regular Army and National Guard. As the Army grew and National Guard units were trained for warfare, the role of the base became increasingly important as World War I loomed on the horizon.
During World War I, Fort Harrison played a large part in mobilizing the kind of trained soldiers that we needed for the war effort. And this was done through 3 officer training camps, preparing leaders for the armies that we had over on the European continent for World War I. So what we had were a number of individuals that came here in 1917 for training, which eventually enabled them to go to Europe and to be officers in the armies that we deployed for that war.
Over the years, soldiers passed to and from the base via the interurban. From 1922 to 1940, Fort Benjamin Harrison was home to the 11th Infantry. Today, many of the veterans of the 11th recall their induction into the Army at the base.
My early days at Fort Harrison, I started in 1936 in December the 9th. And I come out on interurban that went to Fort Harrison at the time. And they unloaded us right there at the recruiting station, which was right at the post office there now. And we stayed there the night, and the next day they took us over and swore us in and took us to our companies that we was going to be attached to. My company was Company C, 11th Infantry.
Took us in and gave us physical examinations, shots in both arms simultaneously, and fitted us with World War I uniforms, heavy blanket type of thing. And this was April and it was hot. And to fit our shoes, even though the joke was everybody wore a size 9, they had us stand up with a water pail in each hand, half filled with concrete. They said that was the approximate weight of the equipment and pack we'd carry in service. And they actually measured our feet, and I got a pair of shoes that fit.
Each company of the 11th Infantry had their own drill instructor and mess hall to eat in, the latter being a characteristic unique to the base. KP duty was a common chore for soldiers to perform, but many were excused from this responsibility if they were engaged in some sports activity.
Well, when you were on a post-athletic team, you'd done nothing in the afternoon for that whole season except practice whatever that sport was you were on. And then when the company would be on guard mount, assigned to guard duty, if you were on an athletic team at Fort Benjamin Harrison, you were not scheduled for guard duty or KP duty, which made it pretty nice.
Sports played a major role at the base in addition to excusing soldiers from KP or guard duty. Over the years, Fort Harrison's football and baseball teams were likened to semi-pro teams. They played other military bases and collegiate teams. Polo was a very popular sport, though strictly for officers. Enlisted men were not allowed to participate.
Yeah, after the polo matches over there at Fort Harrison, they turned out the soldiers to go back out there and stomp all the sod back down that they tore up on the parade ground. And after the polo matches, they'd always turn the soldiers out to go out and return the sod over and tromp it back down.
The polo games were very exciting. They played right on the polo grounds, and the horses were beautiful, and the men were young and handsome. And it was always such a joy to see the enthusiasm of the spectators. And we just thought it would go on forever, and of course it didn't.
Boxing competitions were commonplace at the fort, with different bases and companies engaged in matches with one another. Evidently, a pastime among the troops included Belle Royale matches, as Fred Brookins with the Civilian Conservation Corps observed.
They had a movie theater out there, and they used to come over to the camp to get the fellas into what they call a battle royal. And they would blindfold them, and of course it's outlawed now, and they used to blindfold them and put boxing gloves on them, then they'd be in a ring and they just hit and swing and just sit back, look at them, it's fun. But I never did get into that. I didn't want, but they used to pay them, I don't know, a couple of dollars or $5 or something like that to be in the battle royal. And that was entertainment for the soldiers and the officers and their wives.
The infantry regiments at Fort Harrison moved mostly by horseback or foot when they trained. Horse-drawn artillery batteries were commonplace at the fort, where dry-run cannon firing took place. Because of the relative small size of the base, soldiers often marched with their horse-drawn batteries to Fort Knox, Kentucky to engage in live fire.
One of the things I always wondered was that the old pictures of the fort showed cannons. And I wondered where on a fort as small as Fort Benjamin Harrison they found to fire those cannons. Well, when there was a reunion of the 11th Infantry Regiment here this year, they told me that they didn't actually fire the cannons here because it was so small. They actually had to road march 156 miles on foot and by horseback to Fort Knox, Kentucky every year during the 20s and 30s in order to conduct their live fire for those artillery pieces every year. And certainly a long way to walk just to fire a cannon. They had the horse infantry, and we hiked from Fort Benjamin Harrison to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And it took us 7 days to hike all the way down there and back. Down there to Fort Knox, Kentucky. Then we'd go down there for a shooting of the machine guns, and the 3rd Field Artillery would shoot their pieces off down there at Fort Knox because they had more room.
Trench construction was an important part of the officer training experience during World War I. French Army officer Lieutenant Henry Hay arrived at Fort Bend to train troops in the art of trench warfare. Rifle practice at the base was competitive and intense. One reason was the incentive attached to achieve the grade of expert on the rifle range. If you did, you earned an extra $5 on top of your regular salary of about $18 a month.
This friend of mine was firing side by side. It was at 600 feet, and it was a sandbag rest. You could rest your rifle on a sandbag to steady it. And that 600 yard was enough for me to make expert that year. And if you made expert, you got $5 a month for a year on your pay.
Oftentimes, target practice at the base created fires in the fields and woods. To the rescue came the Civilian Conservation Corps unit stationed at the fort. Comprised of black Americans, the unit not only put out the fires, but was responsible for soil erosion protection and deforestation. The CCC, as well as the military itself just prior to World War II, was segregated in its makeup. 11th Infantry soldiers were trained not only to march and to be proficient marksmen, but they also had to arrange a certain order to their toiletries and to prepare their bedding for blanket inspection. As with most troops at the base, hand grenade and bayonet practice was much more engaging. Fort Benjamin Harrison unquestionably prepared thousands of soldiers for combat and did so well.
Bayonet practice was usually with a dummy stood up and well, it wasn't actually a dummy. It wasn't a way. It was just a round padded thing about so tall. And we was taught to stick it and to come around and so forth, like that.
Fort Harrison prepared us well for combat in as much as your combat depends on the terrain. Your training on your weapons and the tactical use of them is one thing, but your terrain makes all the difference in the world, so that training at Fort Benjamin Harrison was adequate for combat.
For many of Fort Harrison's veterans, tough job assignments like the Army itself are compatible. Moreover, the uniqueness of a particular job is an interesting story worth sharing. Well, see, what I did with the horse orderly, every morning at 8:15 I'd be at the general's headquarters, at his living quarters, and pick him up, and then we'd ride around in Fort Harrison, up and down over there in the West Cantoma. And when the non-commissioned officers and things lived over there, he'd like to go over there and talk to the non-commissioned officers' wives.
We did KP. There were no civilians waiting on us. The GIs all did their own work. They had GI cooks and bakers, and The rest of us scrubbed floors. We scrubbed one set of floors 11 times in one day as punishment, I guess, for not being fast enough and doing certain other things. This was at Fort Harrison.
At the end of the month, I always got to go downtown Indianapolis with the big, we had a huge 8-passenger Buick, and they'd load that up with soldiers with machine guns and everything. We'd get our payroll for Fort Harrison, which amounted to about $52,000 in them days for the whole fort, and paid everybody. And of course, you never stopped for nothing. When you was going or coming, everybody had to get out of your way.
The life at Fort Harrison during World War II centered mostly around the induction and processing of troops mobilized to fight in foreign lands. Revelry was at 5 a.m. as the day got started. Sunsets were spent discussing the day's events over a cigarette in front of the same wooden barracks that would later house some of the participants of Indianapolis's Pan American Games. Soldiers dated nurses working on the base and oftentimes would take them to the Post Theater that opened in 1929. Wives and widows of veterans today can recall seeing their first Shirley Temple movie there. Soldiers would ride the Interurban into Indianapolis for a night of fun, some not returning until the last run back to the post at midnight, only to face revelry at 5 a.m. It was truly a Spartan lifestyle.
He makes a company jump when he plays reveille. He's a boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B.
The men came from humble backgrounds and, in many cases, very Spartan lifestyles, and they were used to very little, and when they got very little, that's all they really expected in the first place. And it was a tough life. And they lived in these brick and these masonry buildings that are still here. And there used to be wooden porches out on the fronts. And I can just picture, and if you remember From Here to Eternity, some of those scenes when Pruitt the bugler was playing those notes at taps and at retreat, and the men were in the sally ports and on the porches and in the darkness, and you could only see them because of the lit glow of their cigarettes. They were from hard times, places like Harlan, Kentucky, Harlan County, Kentucky. And they were listening to the beauty in that harsh life, the beauty of the bugle calls as they echoed back across the quads.
In an event that would find history repeating itself, Fort Benjamin Harrison Army Base was closed on December 6, 1946. In a familiar theme, the Indianapolis Times reported that the fort had been sought by private groups and by civic-minded citizens for a state or city park. Almost 50 years later, the news copy is the same. After much debate, the fort was reopened in August of 1947, at which time the Secretary of War concluded to close the base would leave Indiana without a suitable military installation. Not long after the post was reopened by the Army, it became an Air Force base in 1948. The intention was for Indianapolis to air defend 13 Midwestern states, utilizing Schoen Field at Benjamin Harrison Air Force Base.
The Air Force wasn't here very long. They found that converting it to the kind of uses that the Air Force required was cost prohibitive, and they eventually moved. It was the 10th Air Force that was here for a while, to another location. And that opened up the way for the Army to reacquire the post after the Air Force vacated it, and that's when you begin to see really what I call the rebuilding of Fort Benjamin Harrison for other uses after World War II.
Against the backdrop of the Korean War and the expanding political and military role of the United States around the world, Fort Benjamin Harrison surged to new prominence in the 1950s. The biggest news was that the Army announced the construction of the new Army Finance Center to be moved from St. Louis, and the relocation and construction of the U.S. Army Adjutant General and Finance Schools to Fort Benn. The home of the Army dollar was completed and dedicated in 1953 at a cost of $19 million, $4 million under below original projections. Brigadier General Emmett J. Bean, who commanded the Finance Center and School in St. Louis, masterminded the move to Indianapolis and recommended the construction of Building Number 1 at Fort Benjamin Harrison. A cadet at West Point during World War I, Emmett Bean became the only person ever to serve as Post and Finance Center commander at the same time. The Finance Center is named in his honor. Built on the site of the former Schoen Airfield, the Finance Center is the second largest military building, second only to the Pentagon. Over the years, the mission of the Finance Center has changed. Originally, the center was responsible for paying active Army, the Reserves, the National Guard, retirees, Peace Corps, and those on disability. During recent years, as the military has begun to downsize and realign, some of these duties have gone to other military bases. Building 1 once housed miles and miles of file cabinets that kept the records of military personnel. General Bean noted that the magnitude of the operations made the Finance Center the largest clerical operation in the world. Many of today's veterans that have passed through Fort Benjamin Harrison comment on how the base was like a complete city unto itself. It had its own fire and police departments, utilities, and recreation.
Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana is a complete city, and most people don't recognize that outside of the military. It has all the facilities of a modern city. It has no ghetto. It has very little crime. It's the cleanest city in the state of Indiana. You can drive out there and you don't see any papers in the street or even cigarette butts. You don't see any beer cans or Coke cans, because the people there have pride, and they're of all different ethnic backgrounds. It's the best integrated city in the state of Indiana.
The modern-day value of Fort Harrison is easily evidenced by not only the continued contributions of the Finance Center, but of the Defense Information School, which has trained thousands of military personnel from American and foreign armies in the art of journalism. And most recently, Fort Benjamin Harrison played a vital role as a mobilization center for thousands who passed through the base during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. As Fort Benjamin Harrison prepares to end its military presence in central Indiana and move many of its responsibilities to Fort Jackson in South Carolina, veterans reflect on their memories of the base and what serving here has meant to them.
Fort Harrison has always felt like home to me, and that's really where I got my start in life.
Well, I think life at Fort Benjamin Harrison, if you was lucky enough to get in the Army at that time, which it was hard to get in. In fact, I had to eat bananas to get enough weight on to get in.
As big as a loss at the post will be to Lawrence's economy, even bigger will be the loss of Fort Benjamin Harrison as a strategic military mobilization site in the heartland of our country. For this edition of Hoosier History, I'm Rick Maultra.
This is the GI Jive, man alive. It starts with the bugler blowing reveille over your bed when you arrive. Jack, that's the GI Jive. Roodle-de-toot, jump in your suit, make a salute. After you wash and dress, more or less, you go get your breakfast in a beautiful little cafe they call the Mess. Jack, when you convalesce, out of your seat, into the street, make with the feet. Reet. If you're a PVT, your duty is to salute to L-I-E-U-T. But if you brush the L-I-E-U-T, the MP makes you KP on the QT. This is the G.I. Jive, man alive. They give you a private tank that features a little device called Fluid Drive.